Hi everyone, welcome to Croptastic, the podcast by InnerPlant, and we're officially starting season number 3 with many big changes, including recording. So we're gonna have video now, not just the audio. Today's guest is Jon Entine, Jon, I'm probably gonna pass it over to you to provide a lot of your experience because you have so much, but right now you are the executive director of the Genetic Literacy Project, right? And
Yes.
First of all, I've met Jon at Team Beta, and I'm feeling very happy that we had the opportunity to be on the panel together a few weeks ago, but just had an amazing and fascinating conversation with him. So I'm really happy to have you here today, and we'll talk about farming and food, but I think we can just free flow through different topics that have come up. Starting with, can you tell us more about the Literacy Project and just in general your background?
Sure. Thank you. Super glad to be on the show. I'm actually a lifelong journalist. I was a network television journalist with ABC Network, NBC Network, going back to the 70s, worked very closely with Tom Brokaw, documentaries at NBC. And late in my NBC career, I did a documentary with Tom Brokaw about the genetics of blacks in sports, when you can imagine how controversial that was.
Yeah, it sounds scary.
And created quite a fear, was very well watched, actually very well reviewed, and led to a book contract that led to a book more controversial than the TV program called Taboo: Why Black Athletes Dominate Sports and Why We're Afraid to Talk About It. And I became very fascinated with the way the public and frankly some scientists reacted to controversial subjects such as genetic differences. Ultimately led to writing about various other genetic topics, such as the genetics of Jews, who are a tribal religion, not just a faith-based religion. And I was motivated that because of genetic disorders in my family, because of intermarriage. And that ultimately led me to looking into diseases, how genetics affects potential designer babies, even vaccines in the human area. But I also became interested in an equally volatile genetic-related area, which is crop biotechnology. The 90s was the beginning of the so-called GMO revolution, immediately opposed by environmental groups, I think not science-based, more based on almost pagan religious beliefs. We can talk about that if you're interested.
Yeah, for sure.
Sure. And ultimately led to a number of books that I wrote in the aughts about crop biotechnology, also about crop chemophobia, because again, I think we have a slightly irrational view of the role of chemicals in society and in pesticides. And all those things conspired, I would say, to have me start something that I call the Genetic Literacy Project about 13 years ago, which focuses on how the public interfaces with these issues of biotech in agriculture and in medicine. Lots of misconceptions. We focus on regulatory issues, but really on debunking mis and disinformation that percolates through the the ecosphere. And frankly, the last 5 years have been a boon for what we do. We have not had a more disinformative public debate on these kinds of subjects than we have now. Very split society on lots of issues, but biotechnology innovation is in the crosshairs of both the left and the right. So it's been a fertile time for us.
So I'm curious, if you had to choose the funniest or the most exotic story over the last few years, what is it?
Well, partly it's I am personally the devil from both the left and the right. We have as our sub moniker science, not ideology. There's a really crazy right winger who actually is partly a left winger too. This is the bizarre stage we are at, where the left and the right come together on the far end of the crazy spectrum. But a website called Natural News. And a guy named Mike Adams has a website that gets something like a couple of million visits a day. He peddles natural nostrums, but he also takes crazy right-wing views like the Sandy Hook conspiracy theory, swallows that. And because I am a supporter of genetically modified crops, he targeted me as one of the biggest enemies of the world. He put out a top 10 enemies list in the world, and on it was Bill Gates, Neil deGrasse Tyson, Bill Clinton, and I came up number 9.
That's amazing. I feel like that's a very
Congratulations.
validating. Yes, exactly. You're a good company.
It's funny, people reading the list say, who is that person? I don't know that person.
Okay.
So, but you get that from the left and the right these days. The tone of our culture in discussing even something as important as a disruptive agriculture looked at in a positive way is that people, come out with conspiracy theories. It's government run. Bill Gates is behind this, all kinds of kooky things. So I have a lot to write about, that's for sure.
Yeah. So there's a few stories that you and I spoke about, but even before we get into the specific topics, would you explain, since you've seen the evolution actually, what has happened with the introduction of GMOs, and then over those 30 years until now, from the 90s until now, what are people actually fearing? And then how has it evolved? Is it gotten better, worse? Actually, I can say my position here. I think it's getting better now. Like, we've gone through the trough of dissolution, and now we're starting to get a little bit more fact-based. But curious, what has been your experience?
It's interesting, and I'll reflect on the idea of whether it's better now, because it is in some ways. In some ways, there's an insidious development that's much worse, and is a red beacon warning sign about how we talk about these issues. And I'll get into that in a second. But obviously, the genetic revolution, the GMO revolution, began with insulin, really. Right. In the 70s and 80s, and everyone accepted, genetically modified insulin, that's great. We don't need don't have to make it naturally anymore, and everybody accepted it as safe. The exact same procedure was used to design a lot of genetically modified crops in the late 80s. Approval came in 1995 with a tomato that flopped on the marketplace, but a lot of the focus was on tweaking commodity crops like corn, like soybeans, to protect them against pests, and also to allow them to be what's called herbicide tolerant, which means that you can put an herbicide on it, whether it's glyphosate, which is obviously under attack by many people, dicamba, or other things, and it'll kill the weeds and ultimately leave the crops able to grow. And that's been a boon in some ways, because we don't have to till the soil, which releases carbon into the atmosphere and creates a real climate change issue. And we've been able to grow more crops on a smaller area. And despite the controversy over glyphosate and even dicamba, these are very targeted chemicals, and the international regulatory communities say these are very safe chemicals, despite the fact that there's a lot of controversy surround them. But what I would call the pagan religious environmental groups, the old line environmental groups, really reacted to these disruptive technologies and framed them as somehow violating nature, as if a sweet ruby red grapefruit, which is created by shooting radiation at it over a period of 10 years back in the 1940s, and created hundreds of thousands of unknown mutations. Yeah. You can buy that in Whole Foods stores, and that's fine. But one GMO tweak that you map and is somehow a violation of nature.
I have to say, though, and obviously I'm very much aligned on your perspective, but the couple of anecdotes, actually specifically, there is something about it, right? When we try to do traditional resistance traits, like BT, which is what you're talking about, the insect resistance, or HT, herbicide resistance, nature doesn't like it. Nature doesn't like when we put the exact same mode of action everywhere, and it fights back really quickly. That's why we have so many resistant weeds, and we need a lot more chemicals just to get the same results. And with BT, insects are not affected in the same way because they've evolved. So I don't think this is where that mindset came from. I guess my position is more, we should learn and we should evolve. And part of the problem is we haven't evolved from the first generation to what's the next set of technology that's going to work better. And ideally, something that enables diversity versus the one size fits all that nature is not into, right? This is what we're learning all the time.
Yeah, but I think in the beginning, they didn't anticipate.
They didn't know.
But it didn't come as a surprise once they began.
They didn't know mostly. They knew Yeah, I don't think it was a surprise by any means.
No.
But I don't think they knew how fast it will happen.
I agree to that. And it also happens in situations with non-GMO crops as well, that same kind.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
it's not a GM distinct reaction. It's when
Right. It's a farming. Yeah, that's right. It's part of this large scale agriculture system.
Yeah, farming is not natural. I mean, we are imposing man's views on the land, and so nature will fight back. The first generation of so-called GMO crops really were focused on large corporations in a way, because the belief was we have to lower prices and we can make money at the same time. So it helps the world,
Right.
but also
Yeah.
corporations have a huge market. If they're doing idiosyncratic traits that just affect a few crops with a low volume, they're not going to make money on it.
Right.
And with it costing, $100 million to get a trait approved, sometimes 6, 7, 10 years of the 20-year patent life, you don't have a lot of time to make your money back. So that was a big controversy, and a lot of where the anti-GMOers, so to speak, focused on. I think the game changed around 2013, 2014 with the CRISPR revolution, the gene editing revolution. We had some gene editing techniques that pre-existed that, but CRISPR was such a boon because it's so darn easy. You have high school students now that can develop gene edited crops. And it also opens the opportunity of decentralizing the crop business. In other words, the Bayers / Monsantos, Syngenta, DuPonts, and so forth dominated in a more monocultural kind of business model that has existed since the 90s.
Yeah.
Now with gene edited crops, which is much less expensive, you have a whole range of crops that don't have the huge market, but there is a market for them.
Yeah.
And secondly, there's a decentralization, and it could actually help respond to some of the concerns that you have. But there is I'll talk about it now, or we can talk about it later, but there is a kind of really red flag that's developing over the issue that you suggested, that we are that things are better in terms of public perception about this. I'm happy to talk about it now, or we can punt till later.
No, please.
Oh, sure. Well, I think the organizations that are opposed to genetic modification are really, I hate to sound like I'm a capitalist because I'm kind of a free market person, but they're really anti-capitalist organizations who see agriculture as a big business. And so suddenly we have gene editing, which decentralizes things and puts a hole in their argument, but they're not giving up because they fear, and I think wrongly so, that this will become reconcentrated as the large corporations try to figure out how to take over the market, and they are trying to do that.
And they will.
It's not an illegitimate concern,
right.
But don't go after crop biotech. You said the public approval of GMs is a lot better. It's a public understanding of it, so it's going up. But they're the critics of it are going after these. The new generation of genetic engineering by proxy. In other words, going after the chemical usage related to crops as a proxy for going after the crops themselves. So
I agree. It's been a transition. Yeah, but I don't, and I agree with you. I think your position is we need chemicals in our food supply, and a lot of things are chemicals, and we have chemicals at home, and of course there's a lot of chemistry in our world. People don't think about it that way, but it's true. Still, there's this middle ground that we have to figure out, which is consumers are probably justified to want less chemicals in their food system. And if we have a very consolidated food system that runs on a lot of chemicals, it's hard to change it without some disruption. Right. Absolutely. So, and it doesn't mean let's go to zero. We've seen stories in Sri Lanka. We've seen this fail around the world. You can't go from where we are today to zero and hope that people can grow food. What's the path?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. But there is a myth that we don't need chemicals at all. I mean, I've been reading documents just earlier today coming out from UN agencies, which are suggesting they use terms like phase out the use of synthetic chemicals.
But that's okay, because they're just going to stop farming in Europe. That's their plan.
Yeah,
which is, by the way, not a bad idea. If you want to conserve your soil, farming is not good. There's just this pesky problem of growing food, but
a little minor twist in the issue.
Yeah. But look, we forget sometimes that there's a reason we do this, to grow food, right?
But your concerns, I think, are valid. we do not know how this will play out. It is not inconceivable that if we don't keep the heat on large corporations and prevent them, frankly, from co-opting the gene editing revolution, which has a potential to decentralizing this business, we could be back in the same pickle we were 20 or 30 years ago.
So,
and then the critics are right. They were right ahead of time.
but I think, so what we talked about a little bit, and I've been thinking about a lot in the last few weeks, it's almost this natural cycle that happened that I think will end up where you wanted to end up with the open system, which is, in order to get a different regulatory path, the people that wanted that for gene editing positioned it as essentially the opposite of GMOs, not just on the front of, well, this is close to what nature can do anyways, and you can't see the difference, but also we don't want the same practices. We don't want the patents and the big company structures. And it looks like Europe will support that. So if Europe comes back and says, okay, fine, we're going to regulate it differently, but also you can't patent it anymore, what that means is that the big companies lose all interest. But it also changes the game because, by the way, it's really hard to make money on editing crops. It's really hard to make money on high value crop genetics. Like, I don't know whoever thought that, I don't know if anyone ever thought that there's a VC business for making, raspberry genetics, but there isn't, right? I guess the question is, and hopefully there's a world where academics can create them. Like, who are going to be the people that are creating these things, fully knowing that it's a very small business stream every time?
The reality is there isn't one. I mean, I'll be very candidly, the academic structure supporting innovation in biotechnology, independent of affiliations with corporations or governments, is extremely small. Governments have cut back support of academic innovation in these areas. For better or for worse, it's fallen to larger corporations to do this.
Yeah.
And my big fear is, as legitimate as the criticisms are by some groups that are concerned about concentration of power, if they force up the regulatory heat too much, they're going to create the monster that they claim they want to slay.
Yeah.
Because the only people that will be able to climb the regulatory mountain or fight back against the kind of aggressive environmental campaigns will be the large corporations.
Yeah.
I'm really hoping that, like you guys, I mean, you're like,
yeah, but I was going to say, so we're doing it, right? And we're not afraid of regulatory. I actually prefer the GMO regulatory path because it's well known and very well designed and has been around for a long time. I don't like Wild West situations because you don't know how it's going to end up, and that's not a good thing for a startup. You want to know what it's going to be. But I will say, you can do this as a startup, but you need to have an incredibly large addressable market.
Yes.
So we don't work on tomatoes, we don't work on grapes, we don't work on heat shock, we don't work on things that are not really going to justify the investment that you need in order to get it to market. So that's the one caveat. I don't know who's going to be working on, I don't know, palm trees. I don't even know what it would be, right? But like all these other neglected crops, I agree with you. If you can find a structure where it is open and people can do it in a low amount of investment and a low return, that will change everything.
Yeah, look, there's a parallel to drug development. We have drugs targeted for large diseases where the return is going to be large, but what about orphan diseases that no one's going to spend money on because the return isn't high? It's exactly parallel to it. So it's a delicate balance. I think we're in the early stages of trying to figure out an innovative structure that allows for new product development, protects the developer to a degree, so what they come up with cannot be easily just swiped and replicated someplace else with a lower price point.
Or just taken. You can just take the seed, right?
Yeah.
Use it. You don't even have to replicate it.
This is why we need a good, solid debate on this, but we don't need extremists. We actually need solution-minded people. My problem with Europe is that they're not really solution-minded. I think it's been so politicized, and there's also trade issues involving Africa and other countries.
Yeah, it's all geopolitics.
So it's hard to understand sometimes that whether this is a science debate or a money trade debate on these issues.
Oh, food is both, always. And I think it's more geopolitical stuff than it is science stuff. The science is just the tools that we put in the toolbox.
Yes, but the belief by many people erroneously is that it's a science debate, and as long as we see it that we don't understand the full picture, we're not going to be able to grab the horse by the tail and tame this thing.
Yeah, and most people don't know what agriculture looks like. that doesn't help by any means, right? Because, and by the way, I was one of most people before I started this company. And then I educate myself on what agriculture looks like. But nowhere growing up was that part of the what it actually looks like. You think about very small scale. So actually, that was going to be one of my questions to you about organic farming. What is it? I know it's not, people think they know what it is. Most people don't know what it is. So what is it, and what's your opinion about organic farming?
I mean, there's ways, the way I answer this question could seem ideological, but it won't be. Organic farming, what it was 50 and 100 years ago, is different than what it was now. As a concept, it's an ideology. It is not a really farming method based on science. The original ideas was really to preserve soil as much as possible, recognizing that soil is the essence of farming. You need quality soil. That is obviously a great concept, and it's been integrated even grudgingly at some times by conventional agriculture promoters. And that at the core of it is hopefully a really, really good idea, but it's really a method of growing. It is not a method of seed development. So theoretically, you could have a GMO seed or a genetically edited seed, and you could grow it by current organic regulations, and it should be open to usage. In fact, there's a very
But they regulated it out, so you can't.
Well, regulated down in the United States, it was part of the agreement back in 2000 when they set up the first organic regulations that no, you couldn't do that. But that was an entirely political and ideological decision. That's not a science base. It's not what organics is all about. Again, once how do you develop seeds? The other is how do you grow it? So that debate is now in play a little bit with gene edited crops, because the belief is that gene editing more replicates nature. So the idea that you can't ban nature, so why should you ban the use of gene edited crops grown organically? So it's really, really interesting. But the biggest misnomer, I think, in the public's mind is that organic is somehow healthier for you, better for you, and that you don't use chemicals in growing it.
Who spread that rumor? I still am confused.
Well, and that's hard to, it's funny when I talk about organic farmers and people say, well, but they don't use chemicals. And I say, what do you use to kill the insects and other pests that go after organic crops? Organic fairy dust, is that what you sprinkle on the crops? I mean, you got to kill them with something. It happens to be chemicals. And just because they're organic chemicals does not mean they are safer. And a great example, very complicated and nuanced, is copper itself, which is a natural chemical used as in sulfate form to spread to kill fungus on grapes and potatoes and lots of other crops, particularly in Europe. And oddly enough, Europe uses, I'd say, 40 to 50% more chemicals per acre than the United States and Canada does, purely because they need that particular chemical. So it's very bad for the soil. It's very bad for aquatic animals. It has potential health effects to humans, but there is no real alternative. I'm not going to say, oh, there's a targeted synthetic version, which is better. There isn't. In fact, regular farmers, non-organic farmers use it as well because it happens to be the best thing out there. But it shows how complicated these issues are. And so our debate on this, look, there is a best tools in the toolbox argument that organics offers opportunities to see the world through a different prism. Let's take the best of that vision, combine it with some of the genetic tools and other innovations that are coming out of conventional agriculture, and you have blockbuster ways to farm. And I think that that movement is actually coming together. And I think 10, 15 years from now, the naivete of a strictly organic based system or a old line conventionally based system will both be seen as kind of farcical and outdated.
Yeah. And part of me struggles with it because it almost feels like there's an assumption that the conventional farmers don't want to do the right thing. Yeah. And obviously, I think we both agree they want to, but sometimes the tools don't exist. So maybe if everyone pushes the narrative, eventually the tools get created. And that's what we need.
I don't want to exculpate them completely because there had been a time where there were some tools available, but from a cost-benefit point of view, some of the more organic-focused ones weren't to their liking for that reason. And,
right. No, but that's part of a reasonable excuse.
Yeah. Now we have a confluence, though, where a lot of the tools that we're using can actually help the bottom line for conventional agriculture. So they're going to adopt some of these organic techniques. I wish it was the other way around. We'd have a much healthier food system, and a lot less misinformation going to consumers who are paying 25, 50%, 100% more for food that is no safer, for sure, no healthier, and is costly. I mean, for wealthy people, it's not an issue, but for the average person and the poor, differences of 50% are huge and really a problem in society.
It's marketing. It's got better marketing, right? Yeah. But I mean, given all that, we're at a point of time where maybe the solution that comes up, and I wonder how you feel about this, is we want to grow as much food on as little land as possible, under the understanding that cultivation of land for agriculture is not the best way to preserve land. And I don't know if people understand that, right? But if we could just do that, then the land that's cultivated for food production is not going to be as healthy as it could have been otherwise. But if we can do the least amount of that, then we can return a lot of land to nature. For whatever reason, and I think it has a lot to do with politics and, Farm Bill, but that message is not getting disseminated enough. And this has to be the future.
It's not only not getting disseminated, I think there's a natural resistance to the idea of using cost-benefit analysis. For instance, when the so-called precautionary principle started to arise in the late 1980s and into the 1990s, when it was first articulated, people not familiar with it, it's the idea that if we introduce a new technology, if there's really an unknown out there and that could create more damage with this new technology, we probably should be really, really cautious about going forward with that. The original iteration of the precautionary principle had a clause in it, a cost-benefit clause, is that what is the possible problem if we don't institute this new innovation?
Like cancer drugs or whatever.
Or even in agriculture, like we definitely know, as you suggested, that if we have land sparing, in other words, more intensive agriculture to increase output in a smaller area, so we have natural areas that are preserved and less destruction of other areas that could be used for other things, the food might not be as great. So there's a trade-off. But on the other hand, it's still going to be incredibly good, incredibly important and healthy. But we're mitigating the consequences. But under the precautionary principle, because there's some negatives attracted to it, you won't even consider it. But there you're misapplying it because you're creating a whole set of other problems because you're then destroying land. And so I think we need to be more subtle and recognize that everything is a trade-off. Let's have an open debate about it. You and I may disagree on what we want to trade off, but that's where the healthy debate is, not on whether trade-offs are necessary at all.
So I'll ask you one more follow-up on this. I think this all, for some reason, exists because there's this romantic notion of food. Why? I mean, there's no romantic notion of medicine. No one ever is sitting around saying, oh my God, I want to have abortions the way I had them 200 years ago. That's hard. But why is this happening? Why food?
Yeah, I mean, your guess is as good as mine. There's a logic to it that we eat constantly. Some animals eat all the time, 24/7, so to speak. We eat, multiple meals a day. There's nothing more intimately connected to us. We get sick once every couple of months, once a year, once every 3 years. It doesn't seem as personal and as intimate, frankly, as does food consumption. And so we romanticize it. And I think the biggest challenge for communicators like me is to say, we have to deal with the real world as it exists. Agriculture is a disruption of the natural environment. Let's be clear about that. So how, going forward, do we disrupt the environment, less aggressively? And recognize the positives that can come out of controlling what man has destroyed, as well as improved over the centuries.
Right. Now, okay, shifting a little bit, let's talk about bees.
Bees, okay, good.
This is something you told me when we met, that the bees are actually not going extinct. And then I Googled it and I found out that you are right. I didn't know that. I guess it's like the organic, no chemical thing. I assume the bees are going extinct, or at least doing very poorly because of our monocultures. So can you tell us the story about that?
Yeah, I mean, again, this is a nuanced subject. So if you go back to 2007, 6, 7, 8 in the United States, there was something called colony collapse disorder, where suddenly there was about a 50% drop off in beehives, numbers of bees.
That sounds terrible.
Yeah, it was terrible. And it was mostly concentrated in North America. And it was quite a dramatic drop off. There had already been a drop off in bee production, in the number of bees and honey production over the decade or two before that. But this was sudden and dramatic. Suddenly there were all these articles about colony collapse disorder, and the bee numbers stayed low for about 4 or 5 years. And one article after another, I think exemplified most by a 2013 Time magazine cover story about the end of bees. A World Without Bees was the title. And fascinatingly, just about 2 months ago, the author of that, who's now a science editor at Vox, which is a good science publication online, says, I was wrong, I'm humiliated.
Yeah. By the way, that's the first thing that you get when you Google this topic. So
yeah, exactly. And he says, I was wrong. Bee population is up 31% since then. So it sounds like they got it wrong, and they did. And before, 6 months before the Time magazine article came out, when there's all these flurry of stories not yet consolidated in that titular example, I was writing articles saying, hey, there is not a crisis right now. What we have is historically a problem where the bee, the honeybee, which is different from bumblebees, which are natural and hard to understand because it's hard to track them. Honeybees are worker bees. They're workers. They're agricultural laborers. They're moved from place to place to place, from almond fields in California to
right.
So they're really basically stock animals, and they're not natural to the United States or Europe. They're originally from Asia, and they have had problems for about 40 or 50 years because of something called a varroa mite, which lops onto the back of these and suck little by little the energy out of bees. It's almost on every single bee, and it's absolutely been catastrophic. So there has been a bee health issue. And for people who say now, oh, there's no bee apocalypse coming, let's be clear here. Bees are not in great shape in countries that have the varroa mite. In areas that don't, Australia, Western Canada, Japan's bees have adapted to it, and they now don't have a varroa mite problem, only because they've had more than a century to adapt.
Why don't we bring those bees here?
I don't know. So, this is complicated. Yet, I don't like the idea of people saying, oh, no, bees are healthy. There's no issue at all. There is a health with bees. Yeah. There's just not a catastrophe. We're not going to have a world without bees. We're not going to have a world without insects. But you have to understand, this was never true among entomologists. They always saw this, and now the word is kind of coming out, that this was a tactical move by some environmental groups. Right. They attack bees as a proxy for going after agricultural chemicals.
And he was very successful.
And they were very
almost
successful.
The first mental image that comes to mind.
Yeah, and everybody said, oh, it's because of two reasons. GMOs, that argument kind of faded. Yeah. Oh, no, it's the chemicals associated with GMOs, particularly a set of chemicals called neonicotinoids, which were blamed for it. And I'm not saying neonicotinoids don't have other issues. Again, these are nuanced concepts issues, but neonicotinoids are not to blame for this crisis. In fact, I asked a very, very famous entomologist, the person who named the concept called colony collapse disorder. It was given a name in 2008. I asked him, where do pesticides fit in the top 10 threats to bee health? He said number 11.
Oh, okay, yeah.
It's the top 5.
Where are monocultures in that?
Well, he said the top 5 are varroa mite, and varroa.
Okay, fair.
We have other things. I'm
sorry. We might need another chemical there for the varroa mite. I mean, okay.
Well, they are trying to develop it. The problem is the back of these things, and anything that kills a varroa mite is going to lessen the health also of the bee that it's attached to. So it's not easy to get rid of them with miticides.
Yeah. I think the conclusion that we're coming to is
life is complicated. It's not black and white issues here. We lead a little nuance, but white hats and black hats play as storylines whether it's by the media writing stories or by environmental groups trying to raise money by catastrophizing an issue and exaggerating it. I mean, the biggest money raiser in the environmental movement over the past 15 years has been pictures of pretty little bees on their backs, dead, sent out with appeals saying, Sierra Club, give us, give us, you're tired, you're poor, give us money, and we'll save you from the disaster caused by neonicotinoids. Now they're reluctant to come face to face with the facts because they got to replace it with another scare story, and that's not the way science and public issues should be adjudicated. It's just not fair. I think the psychological resistance to nuance and middle ground thinking and recognizing that something is not going to be easy is something that is not natural to humans, and it's even less natural in our ideologically cleaved society these days. So yeah, we beat the bushes. It took my first article on bees was 2013, got 1 million views on Forbes magazine. I was right, they were wrong, and guess what? Here, while we're right, they've started the same person on Vox who wrote that article, the mea culpa, he started a new fake narrative that it's not honeybees that are endangered, it's wild bees. And none of his sources are scientists, because entomologists don't believe that. But he wasn't satisfied with just correcting the ledger. He had to create a new myth that fit the good guys and bad guys narrative. And I think that's the way humans think, and that's unfortunately the way modern media and the environmental activist movement thinks today. It's an uphill battle. I'm losing. We're losing. You and I are losing. Society's losing.
So, Jon, as we start to wrap up, I'll ask you the final question. It's a small one. If you could have your wish come true 20 years from now, what does our food and farming system look like?
Well, I'll wave my organic and gene editing wand and say, it comes down to my field. My field is discourse and discussion and solutions. I can't predict or hope to say what the food world will look like. I just want a recognition, a bit more humble recognition. Technology is accelerating. We've seen that over past decades, whether it's in food or other things. We have to keep an open mind about it. We recognize that there are going to be slip-ups. Look at the challenges over AI right now. But I think we have to, lower the temperature on technophobia, and sure, keep the feet in the fire of people who are innovating in these areas. But I really hope we can keep an open mind about the role that technology doesn't always have to play a negative role in society. That its benefits are real. Sure, we want to keep a close eye on it, but let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah, that makes sense. It might not be what actually happens, but it's the right path to get us to where we need to go.
Exactly. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jon. Thank you for being here today.